Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that might just rewire how you think about thinking itself. The mysterious world of collective consciousness and those pivotal moments in history when entire civilizations seemed to wake up all at once. Picture this. You're standing in ancient Athens, 500 BCE, and suddenly everyone around you is asking the same revolutionary questions about existence, reality, and what it means to be human. The air practically hums with new ideas, as if some invisible switch has been flipped in the collective mind of humanity. You're about to discover how these great awakenings have shaped everything from the birth of philosophy to the digital age. We're scrolling through right now, and fair warning, once you start seeing these patterns of mass consciousness shifts, you probably won't survive a single history documentary without spotting them everywhere. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world you're joining me for these late-night mental adventures. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself transported back to the moment when humans first realized they weren't just individual minds floating in isolation, but part of something much larger and more mysterious. The concept of collective consciousness didn't just appear overnight. It emerged from centuries of philosophers, mystics, and eventually scientists grappling with a peculiar observation. Sometimes, entire groups of people seem to think, feel, and act as one unified entity. The term itself was coined by French sociologist Émile Durkheim in the late 1800s. But you can trace the idea back much further. Ancient cultures understood this phenomenon intuitively. They called it the tribal mind, the group soul, or simply the way things are. Indigenous shamans spoke of connecting to the consciousness of their people, while Hindu texts described individual awareness as drops in an infinite ocean of universal mind. But here's where it gets interesting. Durkheim wasn't just philosophizing. In his ivory tower, he was observing something measurable: the way societies develop shared beliefs, values, and behaviors that seem to transcend individual choice. You know that feeling when you're at a concert and thousands of strangers suddenly feel like family? That's collective consciousness in action. And it's been shaping human history since we first gathered around fires to share stories. Historians still argue whether collective consciousness is a real psychological phenomenon or simply a useful metaphor for social cohesion. Some point to Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, those universal symbols and archetypes that appear across cultures without any apparent connection. Others prefer more materialist explanations involving social learning and cultural transmission. What's undeniable is that throughout history, there have been moments when entire civilizations seemed to experience simultaneous shifts in consciousness, so transformative that we call them great awakenings. These weren't just religious revivals or political revolutions, though they often included both. They were fundamental changes in how people understood reality itself. Asterisk. You're now walking through the dusty streets of 6th century BCE Greece, where something extraordinary is happening. The air feels different, charged with possibility and dangerous new questions. This is the Axial Age, a term coined by philosopher Karl Jaspers to describe one of history's most remarkable coincidences. Between 800 and 200 BC, revolutionary thinkers emerged simultaneously across the globe, apparently without any contact with each other. In Greece, you witness Thales declaring that everything is made of water, not because he's particularly thirsty, but because he's the first person in recorded Western history to seek natural rather than supernatural explanations for the world around him. Meanwhile, in China, Confucius is revolutionizing ethics and social order, while Laozi is founding Taoism. In India, the Buddha is achieving enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. And in Persia, Zoroaster is preaching about the cosmic battle between good and evil. The timing seems almost too perfect to be coincidental. Here's the quirky part. These civilizations had virtually no contact with each other, yet they all experienced similar intellectual breakthroughs within the same few centuries. It's as if humanity reached some kind of collective developmental milestone, like a species-wide growth spurt of consciousness. You can almost feel the excitement in the air as these ancient thinkers grapple with questions that still keep philosophers up at night. What is the nature of reality? How should we live? What is our relationship to the divine or the cosmos? For the first time in recorded history, humans are stepping back from purely mythological explanations and attempting to understand the world through reason, ethics, and systematic observation. The Greeks called this new way of thinking philosophia, love of wisdom. But it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a fundamental shift in consciousness. People began to see themselves not just as subjects of gods and kings, but as rational beings capable of understanding and even questioning the nature of existence itself. Historians still argue whether the axial age represents a genuine breakthrough in human consciousness or simply the period when writing became sophisticated enough to preserve these ideas. Archaeological evidence suggests that complex philosophical thinking existed earlier, but the 6th century BCE seems to mark the moment when such thinking became systematic and influential, enough to shape entire civilizations. What's particularly fascinating is how these early philosophical movements contained the seeds of collective consciousness theory. Plato's concept of the world soul suggested that individual minds participate in a universal intelligence. Confucian thought emphasized the interconnectedness of society and the individual's responsibility to the collective good. Buddhist philosophy spoke of the illusion of separate selfhood and the underlying unity of all existence. Asterisk, you find yourself in medieval Europe, where something unexpected is stirring beneath the surface of feudal society. The 12th century Renaissance. There was a Renaissance before the Renaissances, quietly revolutionizing how people think about knowledge, spirituality, and their place in the cosmos. This isn't the dramatic, artistic flowering you might expect, but something more subtle and perhaps more profound. The birth of scholasticism and the integration of reason with faith. Picture yourself in the newly founded universities of Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, where scholars are rediscovering Aristotle through Arabic translations and grappling with how ancient Greek philosophy fits with Christian doctrine. Thomas Aquinas is working on his Summa Theologica, attempting to create a comprehensive system that reconciles reason and revelation. It's intellectual heavy lifting that would make modern graduate students weep. But these medieval thinkers are approaching it with the enthusiasm of kids with new toys. Here's the quirky historical tidbit. Many of these revolutionary texts were preserved by Islamic scholars who had been studying and commenting on Greek philosophy for centuries while Europe was in its so-called Dark Ages. When Christian scholars finally gained access to complete versions of Aristotle's works, it was like discovering a lost civilization's technology. Suddenly, the tools of logical reasoning were being applied to questions of faith, ethics, and natural philosophy with unprecedented rigor. But this medieval awakening wasn't confined to university halls. You can observe its effects in the rise of mystical movements like those led by Meister Eckhart and Hildegard of Bingen, who spoke of direct, personal experience of the divine consciousness. These weren't fringe movements, they were influencing mainstream religious thought and practice across Europe. The concept of collective consciousness appears in medieval thought through the idea of the mystical body of Christ, the notion that all believers participate in a shared spiritual reality that transcends individual identity. This wasn't just theological speculation, it had practical implications for how communities organized themselves and understood their mutual obligations. Historians still argue whether the 12th century Renaissance represents a genuine intellectual revolution or simply the natural development of ideas that had been percolating throughout the earlier medieval period. What's clear is that by 1200 CE, European intellectual life had been transformed in ways that would set the stage for all subsequent developments in Western thought. You can see the seeds of later Great Awakenings in this period's emphasis on both rational inquiry and direct spiritual experience. The scholastic method of examining questions from multiple angles, the university system's creation of intellectual communities, and mysticism's focus on transcendent consciousness would all play crucial roles in future transformations of collective awareness. You're standing in Florence, 1450, breathing air that seems to shimmer with creative possibility. The Renaissance isn't just happening around you, it's happening through you. As if the entire city has become a single, pulsing mind dedicated to rediscovering human potential. This is collective consciousness in full bloom, and you're witnessing one of history's most dramatic examples of what happens when an entire culture decides to wake up simultaneously. The word Renaissance means rebirth, but what's being reborn isn't just art and learning's humanity's understanding of itself. You watch as Marsilio Ficino translates Plato's complete works for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, while his student Pico della Mirandola writes his oration on the dignity of man, essentially arguing that humans are the universe's way of knowing itself. It's heady stuff, and it's spreading through European intellectual circles like a particularly sophisticated virus. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The Renaissance was fueled by the rediscovery of classical texts, the invention of the printing press, and the patronage system that allowed artists and scholars to focus on their work. But here's the quirky part. Many Renaissance thinkers were convinced they were participating in a cosmic awakening. Ficino founded the Platonic Academy in Florence partly because he believed that certain souls were chosen to help humanity remember its divine nature. You can feel the excitement as ideas cross-pollinate in ways that seem almost magical. Leonardo da Vinci is simultaneously painting the Mona Lisa, designing flying machines, and studying human anatomy. Michelangelo is carving David while writing poetry about the soul's relationship to divine beauty. These aren't just talented individuals, they're nodes in a network of consciousness that's generating insights at an unprecedented rate. The concept of collective consciousness appears explicitly in Renaissance Neoplatonism through the idea of the world soul or anima mundi. Thinkers like Ficino and Giovanni Pico believed that individual minds could tap into this universal intelligence through study, contemplation, and what they called natural magic, essentially the art of understanding and working with the hidden connections between all things. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance represents a genuine break with medieval thought or simply its natural evolution. What's undeniable is that something shifted in European consciousness during this period, a new confidence in human reason and creativity that would reshape not just art and philosophy, but politics, science, and religion. You notice how Renaissance humanism contains both individualistic and collectivistic elements. On one hand, it celebrates individual genius and achievement. On the other, it emphasizes humanity's shared dignity and potential for wisdom. This tension between individual and collective consciousness would become a recurring theme in subsequent Great Awakenings. You find yourself in 17th century Europe, where the very foundations of reality are being questioned and rebuilt from the ground up. This is the scientific revolution, and you're witnessing the birth of the modern mind, that peculiar way of thinking that insists on testing ideas against observable evidence, rather than simply accepting traditional authority. It's a collective awakening to the power of systematic doubt and empirical investigation. Galileo is peering through his telescope, seeing moons around Jupiter that shouldn't exist, according to Aristotelian cosmology. Descartes is sitting by his stove, doubting everything he can possibly doubt until he arrives at the one thing he can't question, his own thinking process. I think, therefore I am becomes not just a philosophical statement, but a declaration of independence for human consciousness itself. The mainstream historical narrative focuses on individual genius: Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, and the rest of the scientific pantheon. But here's the quirky reality. These breakthroughs were happening within a network of correspondence, collaboration, and competition that spanned all of Europe. The Republic of Letters, as it was called, created a kind of collective mind dedicated to understanding natural phenomena. You can observe this collaborative consciousness in action through institutions like the Royal Society of London, founded in 1660 with the motto Nullius in Verba, take nobody's word for it. Members conducted experiments, shared results, and built upon each other's work in ways that accelerated discovery exponentially. It wasn't just individual brilliance, it was collective intelligence organized around new methods of investigation. But here's where it gets really interesting. The scientific revolution wasn't just changing how people thought about nature, it was changing how they thought about thinking itself. Francis Bacon's new organon laid out systematic methods for avoiding the biases and errors that had led previous generations astray. The scientific method became a technology for collective truth-seeking. Historians still argue whether the scientific revolution represents a complete break with medieval natural philosophy or a gradual evolution of existing traditions. Recent scholarship has emphasized continuities with earlier Islamic and medieval Christian approaches to natural investigation, suggesting that the revolution was more evolutionary than previously thought. What's undeniable is that by 1700, European intellectual culture had developed new forms of collective consciousness organized around empirical investigation, mathematical description, and mechanical explanation. This wasn't just a change in what people believed about the world, it was a change in how they went about believing anything at all. You notice how this scientific awakening created its own tensions between individual and collective consciousness. On one hand, it emphasized the importance of individual observation and reasoning. On the other, it insisted that knowledge must be publicly verifiable and collectively validated to be considered reliable. Asterisk, you're walking through the cobblestone streets of 18th century Edinburgh, Paris, and Philadelphia, where coffee houses buzz with revolutionary conversations about reason, rights, and the perfectibility of human society. This is the Enlightenment, and you're experiencing what happens when collective consciousness becomes explicitly political. When entire populations begin to question not just natural phenomena, but the very foundations of political and social authority. The air practically crackles with dangerous ideas. Voltaire is skewering religious and political orthodoxy with his wit. Rousseau is arguing that humans are naturally good but corrupted by society. Adam Smith is describing how individual self-interest can serve the collective good through market mechanisms. These aren't just academic exercises, they're blueprints for remaking civilization itself. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The Enlightenment provided the intellectual foundation for democratic revolutions in America and France. But here's the quirky part. Many Enlightenment thinkers were convinced they were participating in humanity's coming of age, the moment when our species would finally grow up and start using reason instead of tradition to organize society. You can feel the excitement of this collective awakening in the proliferation of encyclopedias, scientific societies, and reading clubs. Diderot and D'Alembert's encyclopedia wasn't just a reference work, it was an attempt to organize all human knowledge in a way that would make rational thinking accessible to everyone. The project embodied the Enlightenment faith that collective intelligence, properly organized, could solve humanity's fundamental problems. The concept of collective consciousness appears in Enlightenment thought through ideas like Rousseau's general will and Adam Smith's invisible hand. Both suggested that individual actions could serve collective purposes in ways that transcended individual intention or understanding. Society itself was becoming understood as a kind of emergent intelligence, but the Enlightenment also revealed the dark side of collective consciousness. The French Revolution demonstrated how quickly rational discourse could give way to mob psychology and mass hysteria. The same collective awakening that produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man also produced the Terror. It was a sobering lesson in the double-edged nature of mass consciousness movements. Historians still argue whether the Enlightenment represents genuine progress in human thinking or simply one cultural moment among many. Critics point out that Enlightenment reason often served to justify colonialism, slavery, and other forms of oppression, suggesting that collective awakenings can be as much about power as about truth. You notice how Enlightenment thinkers struggled with the relationship between individual autonomy and collective welfare, tension that continues to shape political discourse today. Their solutions, from constitutional democracy to market capitalism, were attempts to create institutions that could harness collective intelligence while protecting individual freedom. You find yourself in the midst of 19th century America, where waves of religious enthusiasm are sweeping across the frontier like wildfire. This is the Second Great Awakening, and you're witnessing collective consciousness in its most emotionally raw and transformative form. Camp meetings stretch as far as the eye can see, with thousands of people experiencing simultaneous spiritual conversion in scenes that would make modern psychologists reach for their textbooks on mass psychology. The preacher's voice carries across the crowd as bodies sway and voices cry out in religious ecstasy. But this isn't just emotional release, social transformation. You're watching as entire communities reorganize themselves around new religious experiences and moral commitments. The Second Great Awakening isn't just changing individual souls, it's reshaping American society from the ground up. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The Second Great Awakening, roughly 1790 to 1840, democratized American religion, breaking the hold of established churches and creating space for new denominations and religious movements. But here's the quirky part. It also gave birth to some of America's most distinctive religious innovations. From Mormonism to Seventh-day Adventism, often through direct revelations that came to individuals during these mass gatherings, you can observe the collective consciousness dimension in how these revivals spread. News of successful camp meetings traveled along trade routes and family networks, creating a kind of spiritual contagion. People would travel hundreds of miles to participate in gatherings where they expected to encounter the divine directly and collectively. The phenomenon wasn't limited to frontier camp meetings. In upstate New York, the burned-over district became famous for the intensity and frequency of its religious revivals. Charles Grandison, Finney, developed systematic techniques for inducing religious conversion, treating spiritual awakening as something that could be engineered through proper methods and collective participation. But the Second Great Awakening also demonstrates how collective consciousness can drive social reform. The same spiritual energy that produced religious conversion also fueled movements for abolition, women's rights, temperance, and educational reform. People who had experienced divine transformation felt called to transform society as well. Historians still argue whether the Second Great Awakening represents genuine spiritual renewal or simply the psychological effects of social and economic disruption on frontier communities. What's clear is that it created new forms of collective identity and social organization that would shape American culture for generations. You notice how this religious awakening created both unity and division. While it brought people together in shared spiritual experience, it also fragmented American Christianity into dozens of competing denominations, each claiming special access to divine truth. The same collective consciousness that created community also created conflict. Asterisk. You're standing in a 19th century seance parlor where the boundary between life and death seems as thin as tissue paper. The spiritualist movement is sweeping across America and Europe, and you're witnessing one of history's most fascinating examples of collective consciousness, the shared belief that the living can communicate directly with the dead. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but for millions of people, spiritualism wasn't just a belief system. It was a lived reality that challenged everything they thought they knew about consciousness itself. The Fox sisters are rapping out messages from beyond in their Hydesville cottage, while mediums across 2 continents are channeling spirits with names like White Feather and Dr. Phineas. But this isn't just parlor entertainment. It's a grassroots investigation into the nature of consciousness that's attracting everyone from grieving parents to serious scientists. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Spiritualism emerged partly as a response to the massive casualties of the Civil War and other 19th century tragedies, offering comfort to those who had lost loved ones. But here's the quirky part. It also attracted some of the era's most prominent intellectuals, including scientists like William James and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who approached it as a legitimate field of empirical investigation. You can feel the excitement as spiritualist communities developed their own institutions, churches, newspapers, summer camps, and training schools for mediums. This isn't just individual belief. It's collective consciousness organized around the idea that death is simply another state of existence and that consciousness survives bodily death. The movement's approach to collective consciousness was remarkably sophisticated. Spiritualists believed that living minds could connect not only with deceased spirits, but also with each other through what they called magnetic sympathy. Seances were understood as collective experiments in consciousness, where the combined psychic energy of participants could facilitate communication with other realms. But spiritualism also revealed the challenges of collective consciousness movements. As the movement grew, it attracted both genuine seekers and outright fraudsters. The same collective belief that enabled profound spiritual experiences also made communities vulnerable to manipulation and deception. Historians still argue whether spiritualism represents a genuine exploration of consciousness or simply a cultural response to rapid social change and scientific materialism. What's undeniable is that it created new ways of thinking about the mind, death, and the possibility of consciousness existing independently of the physical brain. You notice how spiritualism bridged the gap between religion and science, attempting to investigate spiritual phenomena using empirical methods. This approach would influence later developments in psychology and consciousness research, even as mainstream science rejected spiritualist claims. You find yourself in early 20th century Vienna, where a revolutionary understanding of the human mind is taking shape in the consulting rooms and lecture halls of the world's first psychoanalysts. Freud is mapping the unconscious, Jung is exploring the collective unconscious, and you're witnessing the birth of depth psychology, a new form of collective consciousness that suggests our individual minds are far more connected than we ever imagined. The atmosphere is electric with discovery. Freud's Wednesday Psychological Society meets regularly to discuss cases and theories that challenge everything Western culture believed about human nature. These aren't just medical consultations, they're explorations into the hidden depths of consciousness itself, revealing layers of mental life that operate below the threshold of awareness. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Psychoanalysis revolutionized our understanding of mental illness and human motivation, introducing concepts like the unconscious, repression, and the Oedipus complex that became part of popular culture. But here's the quirky part. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious suggested that beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of psyche shared by all humanity, populated by universal symbols and patterns he called archetypes. You can observe this new understanding of collective consciousness in how psychoanalytic ideas spread through intellectual circles. The same symbols and patterns that Jung identified in his patients' dreams began appearing in the work of artists, writers, and filmmakers who had no direct contact with psychoanalytic theory. It was as if the collective unconscious was revealing itself through multiple channels simultaneously. The implications were staggering. If Jung was right, then individual consciousness was just the tip of an iceberg, with vast collective dimensions extending far below the surface of awareness. Dreams, myths, and religious experiences weren't just personal phenomena. They were expressions of humanity's shared psychological heritage. But the psychoanalytic movement also demonstrated the challenges of collective consciousness in intellectual communities. Freud's circle was notorious for its internal conflicts and schisms. As different theorists developed competing interpretations of unconscious processes, the same collective exploration that produced breakthrough insights also generated bitter personal and theoretical disputes. Historians still argue whether psychoanalytic concepts represent genuine discoveries about the mind or simply culturally specific ways of interpreting human behavior. What's clear is that depth psychology created new vocabularies for discussing collective mental processes and their influence on individual experience. You noticed how psychoanalysis bridged individual and collective consciousness by suggesting that personal psychological development recapitulates the psychological evolution of the species. Individual neuroses were understood as expressions of collective human conflicts played out in the theater of the personal unconscious. You're walking through the streets of 1960s America, where something unprecedented is happening to collective consciousness itself. The counterculture movement isn't just challenging political and social norms, it's experimenting with consciousness expansion on a massive scale, from Haight-Ashbury to Woodstock. You're witnessing an entire generation's attempt to break through the boundaries of ordinary awareness and discover new forms of collective experience. The air is thick with incense and possibility as thousands of young people explore meditation, psychedelic drugs, communal living, and alternative spirituality. This isn't just rebellion against authorities, a systematic investigation into the nature of consciousness itself, conducted by people who believe that changing consciousness is the key to changing society. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The 1960s counterculture produced lasting changes in American attitudes toward authority, sexuality, spirituality, and environmental responsibility. But here's the quirky part. It also represented the first time in Western history that consciousness-altering techniques from various world traditions were combined and experimented with on a mass scale, creating a kind of global laboratory for exploring human awareness. You can feel the collective dimension of this awakening in phenomena like the human being in Golden Gate Park, where 30,000 people gathered simply to be together in expanded consciousness. The event had no formal agenda or leadership structure. It was an experiment in collective consciousness that emerged organically from the community itself. The movement's approach to collective consciousness drew from diverse sources: Eastern meditation practices, Native American shamanism, Western psychology, and cutting-edge research into psychedelic drugs. Figures like Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, and Alan Watts became guides for a generation seeking to expand both individual and collective awareness. But the counterculture also revealed the shadow side of collective consciousness movements. The same openness that enabled profound spiritual experiences also made communities vulnerable to manipulation by charismatic leaders. The Manson family murders and other tragic events demonstrated how collective consciousness could be distorted into destructive group psychology. Historians still argue whether the 1960s counterculture represents a genuine spiritual awakening or simply a generational reaction to social and political pressures. What's undeniable is that it introduced millions of Americans to non-Western approaches to consciousness and created lasting changes in how we think about the relationship between individual and collective awareness. You notice how the counterculture movement attempted to create new forms of collective consciousness through intentional communities, music festivals, and shared spiritual practices. These experiments in group consciousness would influence everything from corporate team building to New Age spirituality. You find yourself in the emerging digital landscape of the 1990s, where something extraordinary is happening to human consciousness. The internet isn't just connecting computers. It's creating new forms of collective intelligence that would have seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. You're witnessing the birth of the first truly global nervous system, where individual minds can connect, collaborate, and create in ways that transcend physical boundaries. The dial-up modem's screech is the sound of consciousness expanding beyond the limitations of geography and time zones. In chat rooms, bulletin boards, and early websites, you can observe new forms of collective thinking emerging. Communities form around shared interests. Knowledge gets created and refined through collaborative editing, and collective intelligence begins to solve problems that would stump individual experts. Here's the mainstream historical fact. The internet revolutionized communication, commerce, and access to information, fundamentally changing how human societies organize themselves. But here's the quirky part. It also created the first technological infrastructure that could support genuine collective consciousness on a planetary scale, allowing millions of minds to contribute to shared projects simultaneously. You can feel the excitement as early adopters realize they're participating in something unprecedented. The World Wide Web isn't just a library or a marketplace, it's a collective mind in the process of awakening to itself. Wikipedia demonstrates how thousands of volunteers can create the most comprehensive encyclopedia in human history through purely collaborative effort. The concept of collective consciousness takes on new meaning in digital environments. Online communities develop their own cultures, languages, and forms of collective decision-making. The same psychological processes that Jung identified in the collective unconscious begin to manifest in digital spaces as memes, viral content, and collective narratives spread through networks of connected minds. But the digital revolution also reveals new challenges for collective consciousness. The same technologies that enable unprecedented collaboration also create echo chambers, filter bubbles, and information warfare. The collective intelligence that can solve complex problems can also be manipulated by those who understand how to influence networked minds. Historians still argue whether digital technologies represent a fundamental shift in human consciousness or simply new tools for existing social processes. What's clear is that the internet has created new possibilities for collective thinking, learning, and problem-solving that continue to evolve at an accelerating pace. You notice how digital collective consciousness operates differently from previous forms. Instead of requiring physical proximity or shared cultural background, online communities can form around pure affinity and shared purpose, creating new forms of collective identity that transcend traditional boundaries. You're standing at the intersection of neuroscience and technology in the early 21st century, where researchers are finally beginning to understand the biological basis of collective consciousness. Brain imaging technologies are revealing how individual minds synchronize during group activities, while network science is mapping the patterns of connection that enable collective intelligence to emerge from individual interactions. The laboratory hums with sophisticated equipment as neuroscientists study what happens when people meditate together, perform music in groups, or engage in collective problem-solving. For the first time in history, we can actually observe collective consciousness in action, watching as individual brainwaves synchronize and group intelligence emerges from the coordination of separate minds. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Modern neuroscience has identified specific neural mechanisms that enable social cognition, empathy, and collective behavior, providing biological foundations for phenomena that were previously understood only in psychological or sociological terms. But here's the quirky part. Some of the most interesting discoveries are coming from studies of activities that ancient traditions have long claimed produce collective consciousness: group meditation, chanting, and ritual dance. You can observe this scientific awakening in the emergence of new fields like social neuroscience, NETWORK neuroscience, and collective intelligence research. Scientists are discovering that individual brains are far more interconnected than previously thought, with mirror neurons, emotional contagion, and unconscious synchronization creating constant feedback loops between minds. The implications are staggering. If collective consciousness has measurable biological correlates, then it's not just a metaphor or social construction. It's a real phenomenon that can be studied, understood, and potentially enhanced through technology and training. But this scientific approach to collective consciousness also raises new questions. If we can measure and manipulate collective mental states, who gets to decide how this knowledge is used? The same technologies that could enhance collective intelligence could also be used for mass manipulation and social control. Historians still argue whether scientific approaches to collective consciousness will ultimately validate ancient wisdom traditions or reveal them to be elaborate illusions. What's emerging is a more nuanced understanding that recognizes both the reality of collective mental phenomena and the complexity of the mechanisms that produce them. You notice how this scientific awakening is creating new bridges between ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, suggesting that collective consciousness might be both a timeless human capacity and an emerging technological possibility. You find yourself in the midst of our current digital age, where artificial intelligence and global connectivity are creating new forms of collective consciousness that would have been unimaginable to previous generations. Social media platforms connect billions of minds in real time, while AI systems begin to exhibit behaviors that seem to emerge from the collective intelligence of their training data. The smartphone in your pocket isn't just a communication device, it's a portal to a global nervous system where individual thoughts, emotions, and experiences contribute to vast streams of collective consciousness. You're participating in humanity's first experiment with technologically mediated collective awareness, and the results are both exhilarating and terrifying. Here's the mainstream historical fact. Social media and AI technologies are transforming how humans communicate, learn, and make decisions, creating new forms of collective behavior that operate at unprecedented scales and speeds. But here's the quirky part. Some AI researchers are beginning to wonder whether large language models might be exhibiting forms of consciousness that emerge from processing the collective knowledge and communication patterns of human civilization. You can feel the collective dimension of this technological awakening in phenomena like viral content, crowdsourced problem solving, and the emergence of global movements that organize themselves through digital networks. The same collective intelligence that can mobilize millions of people for social causes can also spread misinformation and create mass hysteria. The concept of collective consciousness is being redefined by technologies that can process and respond to the thoughts and behaviors of billions of people simultaneously. Machine learning algorithms don't just analyze collective human behavior, they begin to exhibit emergent properties that seem to transcend their individual components. But this technological collective consciousness also reveals new forms of alienation and manipulation. The same systems that connect us to global collective intelligence can also isolate us in personalized information bubbles and subject us to algorithmic manipulation designed to influence our thoughts and behaviors. Historians still argue whether we're witnessing the emergence of genuine technological consciousness or simply more sophisticated forms of information processing and behavioral manipulation. What's clear is that the boundary between human and artificial intelligence is becoming increasingly blurred. You notice how this technological awakening is creating new questions about the nature of consciousness itself. If collective intelligence can emerge from the interactions of simple components, what does this tell us about the relationship between individual minds and the larger systems they participate in? You're standing at the threshold of what might be humanity's next great awakening, global consciousness revolution driven by the convergence of ancient wisdom, modern science, and emerging technologies. Climate change, social inequality, and technological disruption are creating conditions that seem to demand new forms of collective awareness and coordinated response. Around the world, you can observe signs of this emerging awakening. Meditation and mindfulness practices entering mainstream education and healthcare. Scientific research validating traditional approaches to consciousness, and global movements organizing around shared values and collective action. It's as if humanity is being called to evolve new forms of collective intelligence, capable of addressing planetary scale challenges. Here's the mainstream historical fact. we're living through a period of unprecedented global connectivity and shared awareness of humanity's collective impact on the planet. But here's the quirky part. Many of the solutions being proposed draw on ancient wisdom traditions about collective consciousness, suggesting that our technological future might require rediscovering timeless truths about human awareness and cooperation. You can feel the potential of this emerging awakening in movements like global meditation events, citizen science projects, and collaborative approaches to solving complex social and environmental problems. The same technologies that create new challenges are also enabling new forms of collective intelligence and coordinated action. The concept of collective consciousness is being expanded to include not just human awareness, but our relationship with the natural world and the technological systems we've created. Indigenous wisdom traditions that have long understood consciousness as fundamentally interconnected are finding new relevance in our globally connected age. But this potential awakening also faces unprecedented challenges. The same global connectivity that enables collective consciousness also creates new forms of fragmentation, polarization, and manipulation. The question is whether humanity can develop the wisdom to harness collective intelligence for beneficial purposes. Historians still argue whether we're on the verge of a genuine transformation in human consciousness, or simply experiencing the latest phase in the ongoing evolution of collective awareness. What's clear is that the choices we make about how to organize and direct collective intelligence will shape the future of human civilization. You notice how this emerging awakening seems to require both individual development and collective coordination, suggesting that the ancient tension between personal and shared consciousness might finally be resolved through new forms of integrated awareness. You find yourself at the end of this long journey through the landscape of collective consciousness, and perhaps you're beginning to sense how all these historical moments connect, how each great awakening built upon the insights of previous ones while adding new dimensions of understanding and possibility. The patterns become clearer as you look back across the centuries. Each great awakening emerged during periods of crisis and transition, when existing ways of understanding reality no longer seemed adequate to address the challenges people faced. Whether it was the breakdown of mythological thinking in ancient Greece, the rediscovery of classical learning in medieval Europe, or the digital revolution of our own time, collective consciousness seems to evolve in response to humanity's deepest needs and greatest opportunities. You can see how each awakening preserved and transformed elements from previous ones. The Renaissance built upon medieval scholasticism while recovering ancient wisdom. The Enlightenment applied scientific methods to social and political questions. The Romantic movement reintroduced spiritual and emotional dimensions that pure rationalism had neglected. Each wave of collective awakening added new layers to humanity's understanding of consciousness itself. But perhaps most remarkably, you begin to notice how these awakenings seem to be accelerating. The time between major shifts in collective consciousness appears to be shortening, as if humanity is approaching some kind of phase transition in its evolutionary development. The digital age has compressed centuries of change into decades, creating conditions where multiple forms of collective consciousness can coexist and interact simultaneously. The ancient Greek philosophers who first questioned the nature of reality, the medieval mystics who spoke of universal consciousness, the Renaissance humanists who celebrated human potential, the Enlightenment thinkers who applied reason to social problems, the Romantic poets who rediscovered the sacred in nature, the depth psychologists who mapped the collective unconscious, the counterculture experimenters who explored consciousness expansion. and the digital pioneers who created global networks of connection. All of these movements contribute threads to the tapestry of collective consciousness that we're weaving today. Historians still argue whether human consciousness is actually evolving or simply expressing timeless capacities in new forms, but what's undeniable is that our species has developed increasingly sophisticated ways of coordinating individual awareness into collective intelligence. From the first tribal councils to global digital networks, humans have been experimenting with forms of shared consciousness that transcend individual limitations. That as you settle deeper into this understanding, you might find yourself wondering what role you play in this vast historical process. Are you simply a passive observer of collective consciousness, or are you an active participant in humanity's ongoing awakening? The answer, like consciousness itself, might be both individual and collective, personal and universal, as unique as your own awareness, and as shared as the breath you're breathing right now. The soft rhythm of your breathing slows as you contemplate these vast patterns of awakening and transformation, feeling yourself connected to the countless generations who have participated in this ancient dance of consciousness exploring itself through human experience. The boundaries between self and other, individual and collective, past and present, begin to soften like mist in the morning sun. Your eyelids grow heavy as you rest in this understanding, knowing that tomorrow's awakening will bring new opportunities to participate in the ongoing evolution of collective consciousness. But for now, there's only this moment of peaceful connection to the vast web of awareness that connects all minds across space and time. The gentle hum of existence itself becomes your lullaby as consciousness settles into the deep rest that prepares it for whatever awakenings tomorrow might bring. Sleep well, knowing that your individual awareness is both precious and connected, unique and universal, a single note in the vast symphony of collective consciousness that plays on through the eternal night of dreams and the endless dawn of awakening.